Good morning, everyone. For the last few days in our daily readings in the Old Testament, we've been reading the opening chapters of First Chronicles. And it's all genealogies. First 9 chapters are all family trees. And we're at the end of that today. The reading for today is First Chronicles chapter 9. And if you're like me, then maybe you struggle to find relevance in the genealogies, because who cares, right? Like I don't particularly care what the names of members of your family were generations before you lived, and you probably feel the same way about me. But if you lived in ancient Israel, things were different. You could almost certainly trace your own lineage all the way back to Abraham. And not just that, you could probably do it for your neighbor on your left-hand side, your neighbor on your right-hand side, because it was very important. And in at least a couple of cases in the Old Testament, Israelites had to prove that they were true Israelites, but with legal documentation showing that they could trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham. And if you couldn't, then you wouldn't be able to enjoy the rights and privileges of being an Israelite. In most cases, who you were descended from would determine where you lived, what land you owned. And in some cases, it might even determine what your profession was, what your job was. So it was very important. And that's why there's so much real estate in the Old Testament and in the New Testament dedicated to family trees. It was very important to the ancient Israelites. And tucked away in 1 Chronicles chapter 9 is something special. But to get there and to find it, we've got to start at the beginning of the story. And the beginning of the story is not in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. It's in Numbers chapter 16. It's the story of a family. The Bible calls this family the sons of Korah. And the beginning of their story for us is right here in Numbers chapter 16. We call this story sometimes the Rebellion of Korah, or the Rebellion of Korah and Dathan and Abiram. You can turn there with me if you like to Numbers chapter 16. We're not going to go through all of the verses here, but we're going to tell the story. And we're going to start at the beginning in verse 1 of Numbers chapter 16. It says, "Now Korah, son of Ishar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men." So Korah and Dathan and Abiram and On, and for some reason, On is never mentioned again. We only see him this once. We don't know what happens to On. They incite rebellion against their leaders, against Moses and against Aaron. And they bring with them 250 men and calls them, I was reading from the ESV, which calls them well-known men. I think the King James calls them men of renown. Literally in the Hebrew, it means men of name. What that means is that every one of these men was famous enough that they would give their name to successive generations of their family. So Korah is a good example of that. Forever after this story, future generations descended from Korah will always be known as the sons of Korah. Even if it's many generations later and their flesh and blood father might have a different name, they'll still be known as the sons of Korah because Korah is a man of name. And so there's 250 people like this that will give their name to future generations of their family because they're so well known. And this is their complaint. This is why they're going to incite a rebellion. In verse 3 of Numbers chapter 16, it says, "They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, 'You have gone too far. For all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?'" So their message seems to be that they want equality for everybody in this wandering group of Israelites. And we can actually kind of understand their argument if you just kind of look at the math, the statistics, and the family tree. It hasn't been that long. In fact, since when Moses was born, when there was this great miracle of fertility, when Israel was still captive in the land of Egypt, and it talks about how the midwives in Israel couldn't keep up with the number of births, and so the Israelites became so numerous that the Egyptians got really worried about how many of them there were. And now, a generation, perhaps two, depending on how you calculate a generation later, and they're all related to each other. It's this huge group of people, and they're all related. If you look at the family trees, then Korah and Moses are actually first cousins, and Dathan and Abiram and Moses are actually third cousins. And just about everybody in Israel at this time are, at the very least, third cousins with each other. And their argument seems to be, why do you think that you're any better than the rest of us? Because to them, lineage was very important. We all are the same distance from Abraham, genealogically. What makes you more holy than us? Why have you taken the best positions for yourself? Spread the wealth, right? That seems to be their argument. But Moses sees it a little bit differently. If we skip forward to verse 8, Moses responds to Korah. Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them, and that he has brought you near him, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you? And would you seek the priesthood also?" Now, twice in those verses, once in verse 9 and once in verse 10, Moses says that God has brought you near to him. What he's saying is God has given you special privileges. Why are you taking them for granted? We won't turn to it, but if you were to go to Numbers chapter 3 and look at verses 29 to 31, you'll find there two things. One, that the Kohathites and the sons of Korah were all Kohathites. So they were Levites because they were descended from Levi. And of the three sons of Levi, they were descended from Kohath. So before they're ever called sons of Korah, they'll be called Kohathites. And you'll find they were given the special privilege of keeping and maintaining the sacred articles of worship in the tabernacle. So in that way, God had given them the special privilege and brought them near to him. But in an even more physical way, this was true as well, because also in those verses in Numbers chapter 3, you'll see that the Levites from Kohath, the families of Kohath and Gershom and Merari, they also had the special privilege of being able to set up camp right beside the tabernacle. They kind of surrounded the different families of the Levites surrounded the tabernacle, and then Moses and Aaron and their families camped at the entrance of the tabernacle, so that all of the families of the Levites kind of provided a physical buffer between the tabernacle and the rest of the nation of Israel. So in a very physical sense, they were closer to God than everybody else in two different ways. And so Moses says twice in verses 9 and 10, God has brought you near to him. Is that nothing to you? You want more? And at the end of verse 10, he says, you want the priesthood too? Now, they hadn't said that, had they? They'd come to Moses and Aaron under the guise of wanting equality for everyone. But Moses, when he says, and you want the priesthood also, what he realizes and what he kind of accuses them of is, no, you just want these jobs for you, not for everyone, just for you. And if there's any question in our minds about whether this was their motive or not, we can probably put that question to rest because of what happens next. Moses says, okay, you want the priesthood, here's what we'll do. We'll have a challenge. We'll have a competition. We'll have a priestly competition. And tomorrow morning, Aaron and I will come here at the entrance to the tabernacle. We'll come with our censers in hand, incense ready to burn. And all of you come. And we'll see who God chooses. And they accept his offer because this is what they really wanted. He says, you want the priesthood? Okay, I'll give you a chance to show that you deserve it. Let's have a priestly competition. Let's have a priest-off. And we'll see who God chooses. And that's what they wanted after all. They say, okay, let's do it. Let's do that. Now, there's a whole separate story here that's not part of our narrative this morning with Dathan and Abiram, who have a different complaint. And they refuse to come up and talk to Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron have to send people to get messages from them. That's not part of our story this morning. But they've got common cause with Korah. They all don't like what's going on with Moses and Aaron, just for different reasons. So the next morning, we can imagine the drama in the camp of Israel. Surely everybody had heard about what had happened, this confrontation. 250 people coming to complain to Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron the next morning come out with their censers in hand, with their incense ready to burn. And then you can imagine these 250 leaders of the people with Korah sort of filtering out from among the tents to coalesce into this mass that opposes Moses and Aaron. 251 against 2. And they wait for the judgment of God. This is what it says. Have a look at verse 26. Moses speaks to the congregation and he says, "Depart, please, from the tents of these wicked men and touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away with all their sins." See, we're not told directly, but here's what it seems like happened. We're going to find that Moses comes to the tents of Dathan and Abiram, but when he talks to them, for some reason, Korah is there too. So Dathan and Abiram aren't there with the 250 men who come to confront Moses and Aaron. Moses has to walk into the sea of tents to find their tents. For some reason, Korah is there too, but Korah had also been with the 250 men, which means he must have followed Moses and Aaron to see where they were going, and then stood side by side in a united front with Dathan and Abiram when Moses addresses not first them, but the rest of the people around them. He turns to all of the rest of the children of Israel around him. He says, "Get away from them, please. I don't want you to suffer their fate." And it says they listen to him and they get away. And Moses says in verse 28, speaking to everybody, "Hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die, as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, or the pit, or the grave, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord." And as soon as he finishes saying these things, what he said was going to happen happens in the order he said it was going to happen. You see, there was talk among the people, probably incited by Korah and Dathan and Abiram, that Moses was lying. Remember, the only person who could hear the voice of God was Moses. Everybody else had to trust that Moses was telling the truth. And a lot of people thought that he wasn't, and that he just wanted the power for himself, so he made it all up. So he says, "Okay, look, this is going to be the proof. I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen, and then you'll see." Verse 31 says, "As soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households, and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly." It was a living parable for everyone. Moses would say to them, "You haven't rebelled against me. You think you're rebelling against me, but you're actually rebelling against God. Here's what it means to rebel against God." And now everybody got to watch the direct result of rebellion against God as these men fell alive into their own grave. It was a striking, tragic image that the children of Israel would never forget. It would be seared into their memory for generations. The successive generations would tell the new generation that came. And verse 36, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Tell Eleazar the son of Aaron the priest to take up the censers out of the blaze. Then scatter the fire far and wide, for they have become holy. As for the censers of these men who have sinned at the cost of their lives, let them be made into hammered plates as a covering for the altar, for they offered them before the Lord, and they became holy. Thus they shall be a sign to the people of Israel.' So Eleazar the priest took the bronze censers which those who were burnt had offered, and they were hammered out as a covering for the altar to be a reminder to the people of Israel, so that no outsider who is not of the descendants of Aaron should draw near to burn incense before the Lord, lest he become like Korah and his company, as the Lord said to him through Moses." Now, remarkably, most of you probably know, Korah's literal sons, who were alive at this time, did not die. The reference for that is Numbers 26 and verse 11. Korah's sons did not die. We don't know the details of that, but they must have separated themselves from their father, and we don't know if it happened from the very outset, if they wanted nothing to do with this rebellion, or if it happened at the last minute when Moses said, "Depart from the tents of these men." We're not sure. All we know is that at some point they separated themselves from their father. And, it doesn't really matter when, does it? It doesn't matter when we change. It doesn't matter when we turn to God. It just matters that we do it. Whether it's late in life, whether it's early in life, all that matters is that we realize the need for change, and we change, and we try to be more like God. And so the sons of Korah don't suffer the same fate as their father, but successive generations of this family have to live with the shame of where they came from. Korah will forever after be a villain in Israel. Because right after this happens, the 250 men still standing in front of the tabernacle are consumed by fire. That's why it says, God says, take their censers and fashion them into bronze altar coverings as a reminder. And then after that, there's more rebellion in the camp, and over 14,000 people die of plague as a result. Korah was to blame for all of that. Generations of Israel after this would point to Korah as the reason why this happened. He would forever be infamous, forever a villain. And successive generations of his family would have to live with that legacy. And if you were to go to those same verses I listed earlier in Numbers chapter 3, verses 29 to 31, you'd see that the sons of Korah, who were, remember, they were Kohathites. So it says the Kohathites were responsible for guarding the sacred articles in the temple, including the altars. But if you go to the next chapter and look at Numbers chapter 4 and verse 15, it says explicitly there that only the sons of Aaron could touch the holy things within. And it also says that the sons of Kohath were specifically forbidden to touch those things upon penalty of death. Their task forever after would be to stand just outside the door and guard those most holy things, but they didn't have the privilege of being able to go in and touch them. This is what Korah wanted. He wanted the best job for himself. Forever after, it would be a reminder to the sons of Korah of what had happened, what had come before. Because this would be a family that was determined to change their legacy because of this one tragic event that would forever define them. So let's come now to 1 Chronicles chapter 9, which we talked about at the beginning. This is a record of a specific group of people. So the chapter is introduced like this. 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 1. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the books of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. Now the first to dwell again in their possessions, in their cities, were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. So this is a record of when the exiles returned. When Cyrus gave the command, he said that any Israelite who wants to can return to the land and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. This is a record of the first people who came back. Now, if you're in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, just keep your finger there and come over to Nehemiah chapter 11, which is talking about the same time period. And I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 of Nehemiah chapter 11. It says, "Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in the other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem." So when the Israelites returned to the land, the leaders of the people found they had a problem. What they really needed to do to reestablish themselves as a people was rebuild Jerusalem, but nobody wanted to go back to Jerusalem. The leaders were there, but they couldn't get enough people to come help out. And so they held a lottery. They said 10% of the population is going to be randomly selected, and they'll have to go to Jerusalem. But verse 2 says that there must have been some who didn't have to be randomly selected. They volunteered. They put up their hands and said, "I'll go. You don't have to tell me to go. I'll go." Because it says the people blessed those who willingly offered themselves to go and didn't have to get randomly selected. Now, the answer to why people didn't want to go back to Jerusalem, the city at this time, why they wanted to go to maybe the countryside or the outlying towns and villages, just turn back a few pages to Nehemiah chapter 7. Starting at verse 1, it says, "Now when the wall had been built," writes Nehemiah, "and I had set up the doors and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah the governor of the castle charge over Jerusalem, for he was a more faithful and God-fearing man than me. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. While they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts, some in front of their own homes. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt." To live in Jerusalem at this time would be to live in constant fear of being attacked. If you're familiar with the story of Israel at this time, you'll know that they had some pretty powerful enemies in the area that might attack them. And so the command was given, let's keep the gate shut most of the time. We'll only open it up at the hottest part of the day when it's unlikely that somebody will attack us. So you'd have to live with that fear. And also, inside of the city, says verse 4, most of the houses were in ruins. There was nowhere comfortable to live. It was a big city with houses that were broken down. If you lived there, it was going to be very uncomfortable. You'd probably have to camp while you worked hard to try to rebuild the wall. So nobody wanted to do it. And they had to tell people, they had to randomly select people to do it. But there were some that went anyway, that didn't have to be told. So come back to 1 Chronicles chapter 9. And this chapter is a record of the people that didn't have to be told. These were the first people to go back to Jerusalem, before they even had to have the lottery. These were the people that chose to go there. That's why this chapter is here. That's why it was important to them. I want to read to you starting from verse 17 of 1 Chronicles chapter 9. This is about the guards, the gatekeepers. The King James calls them the porters. The gatekeepers were Shallum, Akub, Talmud, Ahiman, and their kinsmen. Shallum was the chief. Until then, they were in the king's gate on the east side as the gatekeepers of the camps of the Levites. Shallum, the son of Kor, son of Abiasaph, son of Korah, and his kinsmen of his father's house, the Korahites, were in charge of the work of the service, keepers of the thresholds of the tent, as their fathers had been in charge of the camp of the Lord, keepers of the entrance. There, guarding the gates, choosing to go back, not having to be told, were the sons of Korah, who had been given this guard duty generations before by King David to guard the gates. And unlike Korah himself and those who followed him, who wanted the best positions for themselves, who envied their leaders and wanted to tear them down, these men followed a command from a king that had died long ago to stand just outside the gate and guard it and make sure that nobody got in who wasn't supposed to come in. And that phrase at the beginning of verse 18, it says, until then they were in the king's gate. It suggests that even when some of the first of the people got back to Jerusalem, they found these sons of Korah there guarding the gates. They didn't have to be told, because this was a family that was all defined by one tragic event in their past, and they were determined to change their legacy and be nothing like their father. So come with me to Psalm 84. The sons of Korah, some of them had other jobs too. They weren't just guards or gatekeepers. Some of them were also musicians and singers. And we have at least 12 Psalms of the sons of Korah. Perhaps more. Psalm 84 is one of them. If you look at the title of Psalm 84, you'll see it says, a Psalm of the sons of Korah. And like all Psalms, it's a poem and a song. And it's broken into 4 stanzas. So the first stanza is verses 1 and 2. The second stanza is verses 3 and 4. The third stanza is verses 5 to 7. And the fourth and last stanza is verses 8 through 12. And it's really the story of a journey. And it's the journey of really just the life of a believer, the journey of life. And we don't know when this psalm was written. somebody says they know, they're really just guessing, even if they're making an educated guess. But it seems that whichever son of Korah wrote this song, they really wanted to be in the temple or the tabernacle of God. But they're not there. Because the first stanza of the psalm starts out as this message of yearning. Verse 1, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. He wants to be there. But it becomes apparent in the second stanza that he's probably not there. He's jealous of the birds who get to be there, who can freely come and go and perch on the altars and be there. But the son of Korah is not content to just wish he was closer to God, to just be envious of other people who are closer to God, because he's got a journey to take. He's going to try to get closer to God. And that's the third stanza of the psalm. It's a journey to Zion, through a difficult place, through a dry and arid climate. But when he relies on God, an incredible thing happens, as if water springs up from the ground when he needs it the most. It's the journey of life. All of the pain, suffering that we have to experience on our journey to the kingdom. But the fourth and final stanza of the psalm is where he's made it. Verse 8, O Lord God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. Behold our shield, O God. Look on the face of your anointed. And that, verse 9, is a prayer for a blessing on their king, a spirit very much unlike that spirit of Korah. Please bless our king, whether it's their literal king at that time or the Messiah, who they also believed was their coming king. It's a prayer for the king. But look at verse 10. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. And that phrase, the tents of wickedness, is a direct callback to Numbers chapter 16 and verse 26, when Moses turned to the camp of Israel and he said, depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men. Sons of Korah remembered that had happened. And this son of Korah says, I'd rather spend one day near you, God, one day in your courts, than 1,000 days anywhere else. It's equivalent to saying, I'd rather just stand at the threshold of the house of God for one day than spend a lifetime living outside of it, doing anything else. I trade one day near you for all the rest of it, says this son of Korah. Because this family would change their legacy. And when we think of the sons of Korah today, hopefully we think not of the sin of Korah himself, but of the Psalms of the sons of Korah. For over 1,000 years, this family will pop up here and there in the biblical account, almost always displaying feats of courage and displaying remarkable faith, often when the rest of Israel is in a very bad place. History is full of people whose lives God has rebuilt using tragedy. Think of the Apostle Paul. He was dedicating his life to finding faithful people and dragging them away to prison, having some of them killed, until the moment where he was confronted with the truth of what he was doing. Imagine the emotional agony he must have experienced when he realized truly what he was doing, and he would carry that with him the rest of his life. It would redefine him. So that in Philippians chapter 3, when he describes all that he has been, he says, if you think you've got something to boast of, consider where I came from. I had all of the things that somebody in Jewish society would want. But at the end of the day, he says, in Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, he says, I now regard all things as liabilities compared to the far greater value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. Indeed, I regard them as rubbish or as dung, that I may gain Christ. That word for dung in the Greek is the word skubalon. It's human excrement. I cannot tell you the equivalent English word because it's profanity. And the Apostle Paul, who is the one who said, you got to be very careful about the words that come out of your mouth, this is the one exception where he actually uses it to shock his viewers by telling them exactly how he felt about who he had been before. He gave it all up. The Lord Jesus rebuilt him from the ground up, using his own personal tragedy. Imagine being one of Jesus' disciples. They all had lives before Jesus came along and scooped them up. And suddenly they were on this roller coaster ride that must have been both exciting and terrifying, one that culminated in the man who they believed to be the Son of God being crucified and having to run for their lives and go into hiding. Imagine being Peter, breaking faith with Jesus in Jesus' darkest hour and being completely emotionally destroyed by it, only to be rebuilt by Jesus and given a new, incredible purpose. God can and will use tragedy to reshape us and who we need to be. And this morning and every Sunday morning, he is using the tragedy of the crucifixion of his son to do exactly that, to compel us to be a little bit more like him every week. So let's not waste that opportunity this morning.